Welcome, everyone, to this gathering hosted by the Unitarian Universalist Church of Bowling Green. Whether you are here in person or online, we are so glad that you are joining us on this beautiful spring day. I'd like to remind everyone to set their cell phones to silent. My cell phone is out of reach, so undoubtedly it'll be mine that goes off. We are a welcoming congregation and forgiving too, I hope. Wherever you are, whoever you are, however you identify, wherever you come from, and whoever you love, you are welcome here. Our Sunday services are different each week so that we can honor and learn from a wide array of traditions and beliefs. And I'm pleased to say our speaker today is Dr. Roger Ray in person. Though we each walk our own path here in this place, on the land of the Osage, the Cherokee, and the Shawnee, and now at this time, we journey together as one community. For Unitarian Universalists, the flaming chalice is a symbol of the light of learning and the love of our community. This morning, our chalice will be lit by Diane Lewis. As our chalice is lit, please light your own chalice at home, if you have one, and join us in singing, Rise Up, O Flame. Our opening reading will be done by Dr. Roger Ray.
The intention of these meditations I've written is that they would be offered in unison, if that's possible. I don't know if you can all see around me well enough to read along. Let's reflect together. There is no greater deception than the delusion of innocence, with its insistence that we be treated as if we had no guilt, as if our pretense of perfection or even holiness had merit. We seek the courage to own our failings, our mistakes and faults, accepting one another's forgiveness as well as our own. May we now be free from the feeling that we are in a position to judge our sisters and brothers who are also not perfect nor innocent. Make of us a united community, not of the sinless, but of the pardoned and loved.
We will have a hymn, number 127, and I invite you to stand as we sing together, please. Now we will sing the children out to their class, please. Go now in peace. We will now have a few moments for meditation, reflection, and prayer. The singing bowl will lead us into silence. After the silence, you're invited to join in the song Spirit of Life. The words will be on the screen. As mentioned earlier, Unitarian Universalists have a wide array of beliefs, and the speakers at our Sunday services come from many traditions. Here to share his own thoughts today is Dr. Roger Ray. Dr. Ray is a native of Glasgow, Kentucky, and earned his master's and doctorate at Vanderbilt and was a 2004 Merrill Fellow at Harvard Divinity School. He is the author of several books, including Progressive Faith and Practice, Progressive Conversations and Meditations. His channels on YouTube and iTunes podcasts continue to be the most downloaded progressive faith resources on the internet. He currently lives in Springfield, Missouri, when he is not scuba diving in the Caribbean. Like most people from Glasgow, he started his higher education at WKU. Dr. Ray.
Yes, in fact, my Caribbean partner in crime is here, Dr. Bill Ringo, and I've been diving together for 35 years. And we just got back from Roatan a couple of weeks ago, and I'm headed back there tomorrow morning. So if I'm not preaching somewhere, I'm probably scuba diving now. But yeah, I grew up in Glasgow. I served a student church in Russellville when I worked on my master's and doctorate at Vanderbilt, and I did most of my doctoral dissertation at the Gethsemane Monastery on monastic spirituality. So I have lived in the zip code of EIEIO most of my life now. And now I'm in the Ozarks in Springfield, which is a community sort of like Bowling Green in that it's a medical and university center surrounded by some of the most ferociously conservative people alive in the world today. So I'm relieved to be away from there and to be with you. And I hope I get to come back sometime when I have a little bit more time. I think this is the third date that I was scheduled to be here in person. I know you all use my videos in your service sometimes, but I was supposed to be here a couple of years ago and something happened. I can't remember, but we all shut down for quite a while. And so now I'm kind of booked through next spring, but maybe summer of 23, I can come back and spend a week or so trying to see if any vestiges of the university I once attended or the places where I was back before I turned gray bearded. Let's see, we can get that first slide up if you would, please. Yes, pandemic. For once, both science and government came together to produce a nearly magical vaccine in record-setting time that probably would have ended the pandemic last year, at least ceasing its transmission and also halting its ability to mutate so much. But because of resistance to the vaccine and resistance to safety measures, we found ourselves at the beginning of 2022, almost where we were at the beginning of 2020. I know today is the first day that masks were not required here, and we're going to go back and forth for a while. We've got enough of a little safety window now that we can maybe go out and hear live music again and go to Sunday school and have coffee with friends, but you don't know when we're going to have to go back into hiding. We endured the frightening and unknown in 2020 and welcomed 2021 in much the way that American troops were welcomed into Paris when we drove the Nazis out. But just having a vaccine available had nothing to do with people actually taking the jab. After I got my first 2 jabs, I felt absolutely invincible for a few weeks before it became obvious that something like 80% of my neighbors had no intentions of ever getting it, and that we continued to live in pretty serious danger. We have now crossed the seemingly unthinkable, or at least very nearly crossed the seemingly unthinkable threshold of 1 million American deaths during the pandemic, with more dying in 2021 than in 2020. And most of those deaths in 2021 would have been entirely preventable if only people had been generally willing to follow the basic protocols for the pandemic. How the vaccine and wearing masks became a political watershed is a subject of endless speculation among we armchair sociologists, and undoubtedly will generate hundreds of thousands of PhD dissertations in the years ahead. My fellow Ozarkers in Missouri, Arkansas, Kansas, and Oklahoma, by refusing the vaccine and denying even the existence of COVID-19, actually gave the Delta variant its location where it built up strength and spread around the rest of the world. So if you know a hillbilly, thank a hillbilly, because we're the ones that gave it back to the world in a much more virulent fashion. As we work our way through the Greek alphabet to the less well-known letters, we're now seeing the end, I hope, of the Omicron variant spread. Initial research out of Britain initially said that it was 5 times more virulent than the preceding version of COVID-19, the one that they have now named something other than a Greek letter, B-2. We don't really know what it's going to do to us, but I don't expect that we're going to enjoy it any more than any of its cousins. So I think it's fair for us as a spiritual community to begin to ask ourselves, what really made the difference between the people who've been socially responsible and done what they could, not always perfectly or entirely efficaciously, but we've done what we could to slow or stop the spread of the virus, versus those people who defiantly behaved in ways that honestly made it look like they worked full time for COVID-19. It just, I can't tell you how many times I left running from the grocery store with a basket full of groceries when I just got surrounded by people who seemed to be determined to spread the virus. So let me offer this caveat. Neither theology nor psychology are exact sciences. Both fields are fraught with speculation, projection, unsupported opinions, and as Mark Twain said, there are lies, there are damn lies, and then there are statistics. What I want to share with you today are some of my conclusions about the current state of humanity, and what I have to say, I will tell you, is well-reasoned, well-researched, and can be supported by statistics, data, and lots of footnotes. However, I know my audience, and it goes without saying that any intelligent or rational person might disagree with anything I have to say. And that is the contract that we share with one another. I travel around the country and sometimes Great Britain speaking in Unitarian or progressive fellowships, and we always understand I get the microphone for a few minutes and you get to decide if you want to ignore absolutely everything I said. And within an hour from now, I will be nothing but a set of taillights headed west. And so be at peace, my friends. For those of you who are not a part of traditional Christianity or Judaism or Islam, those of us who have chosen, we have made what is an incomprehensible decision to many of our family members and friends, that we still go to church even though we don't appear to believe any of the things that they associate with church. Somehow we have decided that a life of faith matters even when we have been released from the cage of believing in eternal life or eternal punishment or angels or demons or other flying invisible things that an awful lot of folks still appear to be quite devoted to. What does it mean to be spiritual when you've given up on superstition and magical thinking? Or as one of the residents of Springfield recently asked me on the sidewalk, how come you still preaching if you don't believe nothing? As is true of many Unitarian congregations where I speak, our internet audience is comprised largely of people who describe themselves as being either progressive Christians or progressive Jews or Muslims. In fact, the Unitarian Church in Louisville was typically called the Jewitarian Church because it was almost entirely made up of people that were just sick and tired of what was going on at the synagogue. But every Unitarian church is largely comprised of people that got victimized in some other church, and they found the Unitarian community as their escape. Among Unitarians, I would say the largest group of us are humanists, although I tend to describe myself as a panentheist, which is sort of humanism with a plus sign. I've got a chapter on that in my book, Progressive Faith in Practice, with a little bit more explanation than that, but really that's what it kind of boils down to. And a lot of us, of course, are just sort of flat-footed atheists who are still realizing that there is value to be had in being in community. We have about 15,000 people who listen to our podcasts and YouTube videos every week, and I keep saying, don't let YouTube be your church. That I appreciate every viewer that I've got. That's what gets me invitations to come to places like this. But I really hope our communities survive. That an awful lot of the more liberal, progressive academic churches are going to be wiped out by the pandemic. And I implore you, don't give up on your community. Don't give up on this church. We really need churches like this to continue to exist. And if I may say, especially here, we had Bishop John Shelby Spong speak at my congregation 3 times prior to his death, and he's endorsed a couple of my books. Really, really a great guy. And I kept talking about leaving, and he started donating to our church because he said, I really want to know that there's going to be a liberal voice in the most conservative communities. And I remember the day when Bill called me, actually, to say, you called me the day that Rand Paul was elected. And Bill said, I now live in the state where Mitch McConnell is the most reasonable senator to represent us. And so your presence here is really important, and I hope that you keep it up. But when we're explaining ourselves to our peer group, I really think it's best to talk about what we do believe and to talk about our practices, although we often find ourselves having to go to the negative to say what we don't believe anymore, what we were reared to believe, and what we no longer will ascribe to. What is the opposite of the spiritual life that we want to claim as Unitarians? And I don't want to oversimplify this, but for discussion's sake, I want to look at spirituality in juxtaposition to sociopathy. And in many ways, our current pandemic is the perfect illustration of sociopathy versus spirituality. 2 years ago, as the world was waking up to this awful reality of a looming pandemic, we were encouraged to avoid being in crowds, especially indoors. We were eventually, at least, encouraged to wear masks when in public, to nearly obsessively wash our hands and sanitize every flat surface until the whole world smelled like Lysol and bleach. Immediately, the world was divided then between those who wanted to comply and those who just frankly didn't care. They just were not going to be bothered with it. Now, there was a lot of misinformation early on, some silly politicizing of the whole pandemic, but as time went on, even Fox News viewers had to eventually come to the awareness that even though younger and more healthy people typically, not always, but typically fared pretty well with the virus, that older folks and people with underlying conditions, which I lovingly refer to as being a corpulent cleric, or those who have type 2 diabetes, we were dying by the hundreds of thousands. Then, as the vaccine became broadly available to Americans, we had a full set of methods. We had effective treatments and medications for defeating the virus to bring the pandemic to an end. But that miracle cure, those safety measures, involved people who were not afraid of the virus acting in ways that protected the rest of us who were genuinely at risk of death. In the part of the world where I live, the majority of people were never willing to wear a mask or maintain safe distance. And when the vaccines were being distributed, at first it was the elderly or the sick, whatever. Well, we discovered that when our health department in the adjoining counties outside of Springfield got their supply of vaccine, that there was nobody in EIEIO territory that wanted to get the jab. So my congregants and I just carpooled about 60 miles out of town and got the jab the very first week that it was available, because the people there just weren't ready to admit that it actually was a thing. Unimaginably, it became a part of daily conversation in neighborhoods and in office settings. People who undeniably knew that their decision to not be vaccinated, to continue to go into public unmasked, might indirectly cause the deaths of many other people, and they just didn't care. There have been times in the last 2 years where the county where I live had the highest death toll per capita in the nation, and still people were saying that they didn't care. Now, that seems disgusting to me. I mean, it's inexplicable. I was working out with a young personal trainer who refused to get vaccinated, and I refused to keep going and paying him. And he was like, I'm not at risk. And I said, yeah, so you're willing to kill me for $35 a session. How do you justify that inside your own head? For the same reason that if you are the kind of person that changes the oil in your own car, or if you've got leftover pesticides or cleaning chemicals, you don't just pour it into the sewer, right? Because you don't want to put that kind of toxic material into the drinking water. For the same reason, if you're a decent human being, you don't want to spread a potentially lethal virus to those of us who are vulnerable. When I was in grad school at Vanderbilt in the 1980s, we were told that about 3-4% of society were sociopaths. My professor did, as I recall, tipped his hat and said maybe 6 or 7% of CEOs of corporations. But generally speaking, sociopaths are fairly rare. But I think the pandemic and a lot of the racism and sexism, I assume it's safe to say this here, the racism and sexism that was daily on display within the Trump administration, that has brought me to the painful belief that I can distinctly see diagnostic criteria of sociopathy in more than 50% of the American population. And even worse, about 85% of the Ozarks. So here's the contrast that I'm drawing for us today. Bearing in mind that neither theology nor psychology are exact sciences, but I'm using these terms to try to interpret our current circumstances. Can I get the spiritualities? Oh, it was there. Thank you. I love the way that the late Marcus Borg summed up who was the historical Jesus of Nazareth. And he said, Jesus was the teacher of radical compassion. And once you strip away all the layers of editing by later generations, Jesus wasn't some kind of God on a stick who liberates you from the threat of hell, but rather he was the one who showed, who taught, who gave an example of undeserved compassion towards the people that lived on the margins of society. One of our favorite authors and a peer of Marcus Borg in the Jesus Seminar, Karen Armstrong, saw that this emphasis on compassion wasn't exclusive to the Jesus movement, but actually is a part of the beginnings of Zoroastrianism and Hinduism, Islam, and Judaism. And so she comprised the 12 steps of the Charter of Compassion and invited people from all spiritual traditions to sign on to placing radical compassion at the center of who we are and what we are about. What I would like to add to that is that beyond Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Zoroastrians, and I teach world religions for Drury University from time to time, but I've become aware, as I've tried to dabble more in the sciences, that what Buddhists and Trappist Catholic monks have in common with physicists. And I love the way that Neil deGrasse Tyson expresses it. And I'm well aware that Neil deGrasse Tyson is not the world's leading physicist, but he's the one that I think I can understand. He says that we are all connected to each other biologically, to the earth chemically, and to the universe atomically. That awareness makes me realize that as a spiritual person, I might add a fully vaccinated and recently negative COVID tested spiritual person, that I still wear a mask most of the time in public if I'm not speaking, and avoid close proximity and closed spaces to others who may be more vulnerable to infection than I am. But in contrast, in sociopathy, the next slide, please. A sociopath has an exaggerated sense of disconnection, so that a sociopath feels no responsibility for the consequences of their personal actions. And again, these are two polar extremes. Like, it is impossible to buy a banana in the Midwest that was not harvested by a slave, okay? So you eat a banana, you're supporting slavery. Virtually all of our clothing and shoes are made in sweatshop to slave conditions in South Korea. My daughter is adopted from South Korea. She was born out of a relationship in one of those sweatshops. I understand the connection between the suit that I'm wearing and the shoes on my feet and the unfortunate circumstances of the birth of many of the Korean kids that you see wandering around. There is no way to be innocent and live in the environment of our global economy. However, a sociopath markedly feels no connection to the outcomes of their actions, and they are the ones who will refuse to be vaccinated or to follow any COVID protocols because, as callous as it sounds, being personally inconvenienced is a bigger concern to them than the prospect of killing vulnerable people all around them. You've all seen the videos, I'm sure, of people being drug off of airplanes who refuse to wear a mask on an airplane, even in the height of the pandemic, because they refuse to be one of the sheep that actually believes in science. Now, this gets to be a bit more difficult because officially, at least according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, there isn't a diagnosis called sociopathy, but rather the DSM, this is going to be too small for you all to use it very well, so you're going to have faith in me that I'm not lying to you. We'll see how that goes. But we use the term sociopathy to describe a range of mental disorders, but primarily it addresses antisocial personality or narcissism. Most of the people in prison, for example, have to a greater or lesser degree, a kind of antisocial personality disorder. They don't conform to social norms. And I've done some work in prisons and done a lot of work with ex-cons. And they don't understand why any of you follow the laws and the social norms of society. A sociopath can lie to you as easily as most of us can breathe. They tend towards violence. They break laws because these laws mean nothing to them. And if you make them angry, then you deserve to be stabbed. Whereas the narcissist may similarly have little regard for social norms and nearly a total lack of any capacity for empathy. They love themselves and they do not want to go to jail. And they do want to be in charge of the world. And so a narcissist is basically an antisocial personality who has learned how to be charming. They can be seductive with their charm. They will use people, they will exploit them, but they are much less likely to stab them or steal from them, unless charm and seduction can be called what it oftentimes is, stealing. A narcissist could, for example, with no qualifications whatsoever, run for president of the United States. We've seen it. And an antisocial person might run over you while they are drunk driving and blame you for being out on the street. But neither of them is the least bit concerned with whether or not they give you COVID-19, or for that matter, whether you have access to health care or to education or to decent housing. That's how we've ended up with a debate ever since the Johnson administration, in my memory, and I think possibly even earlier, about why are we the only advanced nation in the world that doesn't have universal health care? Why? Why was it ever acceptable to us to have 80% of our society covered in health care and 20%, which winds up being 60 to 80 million Americans, with none at all? I mean, doesn't that make you wonder about our character from the start? I'm 65 now, loving Medicare. Wish everybody had it, shouldn't they? I'm trying to create these two categories in our minds, that spiritual people should inherently be compassionate people. And I know we unlock the doors and whoever comes in is part of our churches, right? That's how we do it. So there's always some sociopaths within the congregation. I've loved the oldest of the Gospels is Mark, and the very first opening of Mark, the first thing Jesus does is go to the synagogue in Capernaum, and the first person he meets is a demon. And I'm like, that demon had been going to church there for a long time before Jesus showed up. So when you have your board meetings and someone says, "Oh, if you do that, then I'm leaving the church," regardless of what everybody else says, there's your sociopath. They'll almost always identify themselves because we've all got them. Sociopaths are people who are radically self-focused, who, if they ever felt empathy for anyone who was not a part of their very narrowly defined family or tribe, their own blood kin, if they ever felt any empathy, they have learned how to suppress it, to abandon it, to live as if it's forgotten entirely. So I bring it up because I believe that even though these are distinct, diagnosable mental deficiencies, that I still believe that it's a matter of choice. Not an easy choice, not a one-and-done choice, but I hold on to the famous Unitarian Henry David Thoreau saying, "I know of no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability of a person to elevate his or her life by conscious endeavor." Let me say it again. I find nothing to be more encouraging than the undeniable fact that any one of us can improve our character and our lives by conscious choice. You may choose, in addiction treatment, we say it's one of two ways. Sometimes you just follow the program, even if you don't like it and don't believe it, in order to get sober. And sometimes we change the way you think so that it will change your behaviors. But whether you're changing the behaviors or changing the thinking, by conscious choice, you can change your life. That is, you may have been born a sociopath. And most of us were. I've never understood that. I slept like a baby. I've had a baby. And they scream and yell to be fed in the middle of the night because they don't really care about you. You wake up and feed me. So you may have been born a sociopath, and just looking at you, I think probably most of you were, that's how we start out in life. But now it's 2022, and we get to make some choices. Now the pandemic is maybe ending. Maybe we're actually going to make some progress, although this war in Ukraine is just driving me crazy. I cannot believe that we're in greater danger of a nuclear war right now than we were during the Cuban Missile Crisis even. But by and large, we are at the cusp of great social transformation. So who are we going to be? How is our race going to survive things like income disparity, an unequal and unjust distribution of health care, even including the vaccines? Part of the generation of these variants is that Americans have had access to more than twice as many vaccines as we could use, while we have not distributed it very fairly to poorer nations. And there's a whole list of other social ills that come along with hoarding and greed and racism. I really believe that the answer is a spiritual answer. And I've been victimized by the insanity of church organizations, organized religion. I don't blame anybody that doesn't go to church. I get it. I've been fired by some of the best congregations that you've ever wanted to encounter. And, I get lots of invitations to speak elsewhere, not many invitations to come and be the settled pastor because, that whole taillight thing I mentioned earlier, that's a really great out for a lot of folks. They can tolerate me once in a while, but not on a regular basis. But I believe that communities like yours offer an answer to society's progress and possibly even to society's survival. That we are showing that we are capable of being absolute monsters. The image of the dragon is present in every culture in the world, and Jung argued that it is an archetype for the human being. A dragon is a snake that can fly, that speaks to our human potential, Any one of us can be an absolute serpent. Any one of us could grow wings and fly. You see that? That within our deliberation about who we are, we have the potential to go either way. This next slide is Lama Migmar. It was my good fortune to be a Merrill Fellow at Harvard Divinity School in the fall of 2004, and I was taking a course in world religions under the renowned scholar Diana Eck, and she invited this Buddhist scholar, Lama Migmar, to answer some of our questions during our study of Buddhism. And he sat there the whole hour looking very much like this, as we pilloried him with questions about why Buddhism was being so slow to accept different sexual orientations, how he felt about China's control of Tibet, the safety of the Dalai Lama, and of course it was 2004. So we had just invaded Iraq, we'd been in Afghanistan for 3 years, and from the content of his answers, it was obvious that he was well informed and deeply concerned about all of these issues. And yet he sat there with this grin on his face. And I was in the second row. I was thinking, do we seem juvenile to you? Are our questions shallow? Are we being irrelevant? Is this funny? Because, you know, folks, you have to be pretty self-confident to just grin at a whole classroom full of Harvard graduate students that are asking you, I don't care who you are, that's an intimidating spot to be in. But a student finally just broke out and asked him, what are you smiling about? And he said that Buddhist teachers choose to smile no matter what's going on as a gift to the world. Yes, there is terrorism. Yes, there is the looming threat of superpowers, especially now. It could take so little for Russia and the United States to start using nuclear weapons. But still, you live in Bowling Green, there are still cultural prejudices, there's still poverty, and on and on and on. But the spiritual master chooses to bless the world with a smile, which, outside of the heady narcissism of a Harvard grad school classroom, may be received as a sign of kindness, of acceptance, maybe even of love. Tolerance is not enough for us, is it really? I mean, we insist that we show tolerance to people of all sexual orientations and races and what have you, but is tolerance our goal? I don't think so. It doesn't seem enough. It ought to approximate love. Spirituality should not then be a denial of reality. There is no virtue in choosing to turn off the news and be uninformed. Not being aware is not something to brag about. I think it's something to be ashamed of. I apologize if that offends you, but yeah, the news really sucks right now. And Bill and I were on Roatan. We had a couple on our dive boat from the Ukraine, and we had breakfast, lunch, and dinner with them and continued to process the beginning of the war as we were there scuba diving. If you turn off the news, if you stop reading, if you stop being informed, doesn't that amount to a smug indifference towards the suffering of others? But to be aware, to know what's going on, but to choose kindness, to suspend judgment, to telegraph acceptance and love, even if it's just through a smile. I'm saying that gets to the heart of what it means to be in a spiritual community. He explained, to grow in the Buddhist way is to move from intellect into faith, turning blind faith into wisdom faith, a term that most of us would shy away from using, but it exists. There's blind faith and there's informed faith. Who will we be as the world emerges from this pandemic? If we are simply religious in an otherworldly kind of way, escaping into magical thinking about heaven or some other reality comprised of unseen spirits, whether they're angels or leprechauns, muses or the Loch Ness Monster, then I fear that churches are choosing irrelevance and in the end, extinction. We do not seek out a spiritual life in order to deny reality. I'm suggesting that we delve into understanding science and economics, sociology, psychology, history, but no matter how woke we become, no matter how wise and informed we may be, we must not allow ourselves to fall prey to cynicism. Cynicism can paralyze a generous heart. Cynicism always leads to the kind of individualism that allows us to put distance between ourselves and those who are other. It becomes narcissism. It becomes a sociopathy. I am pleading with you then to continue to be informed and then to move from intellect to faith, from blind faith to wisdom faith, and to give the world your kindness, your understanding, your acceptance, and your love, even with a smile. That's who I hope we will be in this very stressful year, the year in which I hope we see the end of a global pandemic, and yet with a reignited Cold War on the face of a dying planet. There are things about which those of us who are awake will be very angry, but I ask you to turn your anger into energy for action in a world that is waiting to be saved from its most base instincts, and try your best to do it in kindness and in love. Thank you for having me with you.
Thank you so much for those words. As part of our responsible search for truth and meaning, we encourage thoughtful discourse. After the service, you are especially invited today to join in the discussion here at church or on Zoom, in the meditation garden between the buildings, or in the fellowship hall where we will have social time complete with coffee or tea. This congregation and the work we do is supported by the voluntary generosity of all who contribute. Today, there will be a special offering, and Diane will tell us more about our third Sunday beneficiary.
Today's third Sunday charity will be Planned Parenthood. Reproductive rights are under attack, and they're going to be so in Kentucky. Natalie Barman, who is leading the reproductive rights team on Kujan, went through all of the bills, the two bills that we are against, House Bill 3 and House Bill 323, and all of the maternal bills and infant health bills that we are for, and I've made a printout for you. You can call the legislative line and you can tell them they'll take every one of these in one call. Please do so. Planned Parenthood is more than just abortion. The core of Planned Parenthood medical services are for prevention purposes for men, women, and children, including STDs, AIDS, contraception, family planning, cancer screenings, and sex education. We expect this summer the Supreme Court to rule against Roe, and Kentucky is ready to bring it down like Texas did. It makes a difference when the legislators receive your calls, so please try to call, and this morning our plate will go toward Planned Parenthood. And by the way, Natalie and Charlie are celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary in Mexico.
Excuse me. So we will see on the screen places where we can donate, or you can leave your contribution in the basket at the door. thank you for these gifts. May we use them wisely in the service of our congregation and our community. We would like to take a moment to thank our behind-the-scenes volunteers who made this service possible today. Our service coordinator was Diane Lewis. Matt Hazel was our technical director, and our Zoom host was Lisa Del Porto. Thank you all for your time and talent. Our community has some news and some announcements. A change in the service from the newsletter is that next week we will have Slava Ukraini, a call for peace. It'll be a beautiful service with lovely music and a chance to share our thoughts about the ongoing conflict. Ken has some announcements he would like to make, so I'd like to invite him up at this time. Is he still here? Oh, there he is. I couldn't see it.
As you've heard, we're reinstituting our socialization over in the fellowship hall today. So you're all invited to mosey on over there for a little while. There will be some snacks, and those snacks will be served. Laura McGee and Matt Foraker are doing those jobs today. Tim McGahey and Jeff Strong helped to get that all set up earlier this morning. So we're all looking forward to that. At the same time, we have to get our hospitality team back together. And to that end, next Sunday at 9:30 a.m. over in the fellowship hall, if you're interested in getting involved, please show up, because they will go through the whole rigmarole of pouring peanuts and making coffee and doing all those things. So please, we need everybody to be involved so we can keep this going and have some fun. Many of you remember Jim Haynes, a long-time member of our congregation, very involved, instrumental person, who moved to Knoxville a few years ago. Well, he's back in town this weekend, and he's celebrating his 80th birthday this afternoon at the home of one of our members, Lynn Hines. So you're all invited to go over there and wish him happy day and have a little food and refreshment. I have the exact address. It's nearby, so if you think you can do that, starting about 2 o'clock this afternoon, just see me over in the fellowship hall. I'll be glad to tell you where to go. It's always fun to see Jim. He's a character, too. Okay, so from the financial stewardship team, the annual budget drive is about to begin, so please plan on being contacted by one of them, I should say one of us, in that regard. Also, as we enter April, this is the last quarter of the church fiscal year. Please do me a favor and check your own records to see how well you're keeping up with your pledge for this current fiscal year. Okay? Appreciate that. Finally, the beautiful spring brings lots of greenery, and so buildings and grounds can use your help. There's some things that need to be trimmed and pulled and weeded and made beautiful. You can see me about that. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ken. It's so nice to have things to announce, that activity is coming back. And Dr. Ray will be across the hall in the fellowship hall, and he has books. So you're welcome to pick one up and have it signed. So thank you. If you have questions about Unitarian Universalism or about joining this congregation, please speak with a member of our membership team. I think Nancy's on that, right? And Sharon. Or you can email our board president at president@uubgky.org. As always, you can find more news by reading the weekly updates and checking our Facebook page. Our last hymn will be number 131, Love Will Guide Us. Please stand if you're willing and able. Okay. All righty. We will now bid farewell to those who have joined us online. We hope you found this service meaningful, and we invite you to join us again in the future. Be well, and go in peace.